Who are the Miami Dolphins players on the roster this offseason that could afford the Dolphins some significant savings if they don't make the roster bubble? We're exploring that here today on this episode of Locked On Dolphins.
You are Locked On Dolphins, your daily Miami Dolphins podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, Miami, welcome to another episode of Locked On Dolphins. It's your team every day here on the Locked On Network. I'm your host, Kyle Krabs, a lifelong Miami Dolphins fan, host of Locked On Dolphins, co-host of Locked On NFL Scouting. You can find our shows on YouTube or wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. Tip of the cap to our everydayers because it is your team every day. We don't just say it, we live it here on the Locked On Network. And today on the show, we are exploring the roster bubble a little bit more in depth, and in particular, some players who are on the bubble who may afford the Dolphins some meaningful salary cap savings. And we've talked this offseason about winning in the margins and understanding where the margins are and how the Dolphins are trying to operate there as they try to thread this needle for long-term competitiveness amidst salary cap and salary and cash reappropriation and redistribution. And this is a show that we've kind of touched on here and there, but we haven't taken the full dive into. And I think it's worth giving some time and attention to here today on the show. Obviously, was off on Thursday for 4th of July. Today was supposed to be the Friday show. It ends up being the Saturday show. I feel like Stu from The Hangover. We are back, right? Like we went. My dad is a very avid Smoky Mountains, Tennessee, Gatlinburg. So me and the family went down there for this past week. So I'd recorded a couple shows in advance for the beginning of the week, and we ended up staying an extra day on the way back. So back in the saddle here at the house now. I was hoping to get a Friday show up. It's a Saturday show, so I appreciate you guys sticking with me. Long story short, running on a bunch of caffeine, about 1,200 milligrams of caffeine a day. And anybody who's got little ones and goes on vacation, this is the vacation, is sitting back down and talking some Dolphins football. So let's dive into this. What constitutes bubble players and savings? I'm going to be using the overthecap.com roster management tool, which you can use. It's free, to be looking at and identifying these players that afford you the kinds of margins and savings relative to other players that may help swing a decision one way or another, right? There's these position battles for the Dolphins. Not too many of them are starting positions, though. You think about the skill group, the wide receiver 3 this year issue is settled with Odell Beckham. Think about the tight end room. I think that one's a little bit more open. The running back pecking order, it's going to be a committee. Defensively, it's more, hey, who's going to be the fourth edge guy for in the event that both Jalen Phillips and Bradley Chubb aren't ready to go. Calais Campbell kind of takes the other starting interior spot when you go even fronts. The linebackers are settled. The third outside corner is kind of open, but a lot of the competition is going to be special teams and depth players on this roster. And that's worth noting because the bubble players, there's players that have been here for a while that are incumbents that have some new competition. And those are the kinds of players that I'm looking at as on the bubble because they're players that the Dolphins have not been completely not invested in. There's a marginal investment here. But if you move on from a player and the player who makes the roster instead of you is a minimum salary player or a player on a rookie contract, whatever that looks like, you may be looking at hundreds of thousands of dollars in savings, or in some cases, 7 figures in savings against your salary cap. And for a team that has the long-term scope of it's much healthier next year than it was going into this past offseason, and we've done that show, right? We looked at 2025. We understand that this is, you don't have the same hole to dig yourself out of, even if it is still not free spending blank checks for anybody who wants to come play for the Dolphins. So that is kind of the criteria that I'm narrowing this focus down on. It's players who are kind of battling for those spots on the roster that are in the 40s and 50s. This is not who's going to be your starting outside corner when Jalen Ramsey's in the nickel, right? Those guys are in competition for those spots, but they're going to make the team, right? Who are the players that are on the bubble that can afford you significant salary cap savings? And significant not being millions and millions of dollars, but if all the guys that are fighting for the 53rd spot are $915,000 salaries, but then you have a guy with a $2 million salary cap hit and you move on from that guy, it's an extra $1 million you might put in your pocket. So that is kind of the definition that we're operating with as it pertains to roster bubble savings for the Miami Dolphins. So overthecap.com currently has the Dolphins listed at about $16 million in cap space. That is obviously their top 51 players and cutoff right now. That will expand to 53 players when the Dolphins finalize their opening season roster when we get through the end of the preseason. That, if you don't use it, you can carry it over, which is important for us to remember for the Dolphins and how they strategize what to do with this remaining cap space that they have. But the more that they can add, the more wiggle room you can have to carry as much over to kind of tee yourself up for the next on-ramp into a kind of more, I don't say loaded, but like the circle of life in the NFL. Cyclically, I don't think is right. Nobody's ever confused me with being an English guy or a math guy. Look at the Baltimore Ravens last year, right? Like they had this big peak in talent and it's dropped off, and then they're going to kind of gear themselves up for another aggressive run. Miami is trying to stay competitive through that cycle. And Baltimore should be competitive through that cycle as well. But there's no question, and I did this for Substack over on Touchdown Miami, and I wrote it all out, and I said, look, here's the position rooms: quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, offensive tackle, interior offensive line, interior defensive line, edge, linebacker, corner, safety. They're better top to bottom in a majority of the rooms, but the top talent that they've lost, you've made some concessions with. Getting some of that top talent peaked back up is part of that cycle, and you being able to carry over salary cap space into another window could theoretically allow you to do that on some multi-year contracts and not just Calais Campbell and Jordan Poyer and Marcus May for these 1 year, $2 million contracts. Right. So who are some of the options on offense as far as players that have a higher than minimum veteran salary or higher than minimum salary, who don't carry a lot of dead cap hit, who are going to be in the battle for some of these roster spots in the 40s and 50s? That's kind of where our focus is going next here on this episode of Locked On Dolphins. So make sure that you stick with us. Passion, drive, and patience are not just the formula for winning championships. It's also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance, whether that's superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time, or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber and not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions do apply. eBay Guarantee Fit available only to U.S. customers. So we're over the cap and their roster management tool, which allows you to decide, what kind of transactions do you want to make? Do you want to try and trade this player if they've got a guaranteed salary to offload the whole thing and see what that does to your salary cap, not just this year, but long term, so on and so forth. But we'll start with the offensive side of the ball, and the biggest salary cap hit that the Dolphins kind of have some wiggle room with, and you could save more than 50%, although it does carry a nothing dead cap hit with it, is running back Jeff Wilson. And Jeff Wilson realistically is RB4 on this pecking order in a best case scenario, unless Jalen Wright comes in and it's just an abject disaster from the jump, which I don't think is going to happen. Jeff Wilson carries nearly a $2.5 million cap hit for this upcoming season. They can save $1.2 million of that by cutting Jeff Wilson and moving on. Whether or not that ultimately ends up happening is up to Jeff Wilson and his ability to kind of make it a decision the team can't bring themselves to make. But based on how things went at the end of the year last year, and to some of that was not necessarily a detriment of Jeff Wilson, right? There was some time that was missed for health purposes, felt like he could contribute to the team. He had a few spurts where like, hey, he's running hard, but if running hard's not the requisite, right? Jeff Wilson, the best thing he has going for him is the experience in the scheme. But for Miami to make kind of the investments that they've made in Achane and in Jalen Wright, I think that does push Jeff Wilson in you're competing with Chris Brooks, who's on a UDFA contract. You're competing with Savon Ahmed, who's another name that we're going to talk about here because he has no guaranteed salary, and he's scheduled to make a salary of 7 figures. Well, at the very least, Jeff Wilson, to save $1.2 million, is probably the most high-profile name. I know some people have kind of kicked around the idea of, hey, if we're going to overhaul the tight end room and we're going to be all in on Jody Fortson, what happens with Durham Smythe? Could you make some moves with Durham Smythe? I think they still like Durham. They restructured Durham this offseason to kind of make some more cap space. He actually has more of his cap hit at $3.3 million is attributed to prorated signing bonuses than his base salary this year. It's almost $1.5 million is prorated signing bonuses for his cap hit. And he's going to get a vet minimum salary because they restructured him. They max restructured him. So $1.125 million is owed in weekly game checks for the rest of the season. You would lose money if you moved on from Durham Smythe, although you could it would be the post-June 1st cut. So you would save $1.8 million, but you would lose in dead cap $1.5 million. So I don't think you would cut Durham Smythe anyway. I think he's kind of still the universal glue player, can do all of the things, even if none of them are done at a particularly high level. Or Jody Fortson, a little bit more receiving specialist, and Julian Hill right now is a little bit more of a blocking specialist, even though there's more of an athletic ceiling to tap into. Jonnu Smith, they just signed. Obviously, they're not going to move on from him. So if you traded Durham Smythe post June 1st, again, it would be the same as cutting him based off of all the prorated money. And the fact that they just restructured him, I think, does make that a little bit null and void for ideas and brainstorms from Miami. Not that it's super restrictive and you couldn't do it, but I think he does play too big of a role in what they have in that room to be kind of the universal player to do all things. And we mentioned from the running back position, Savon Ahmed to go with Jeff Wilson. I think Savon's probably facing a pretty steep uphill climb between him and Chris Brooks, although the money is fairly negligible between the two. Your top 3 backs are the 2 third-round picks from the last 2 seasons and Raheem, right? Do I think they carry a 4th? Probably. Do I think it's Chris Brooks from a combination of price, cap savings, special teams performance? Probably. Savon's not the biggest guy. Savon is owed $1.06 million. None of that is guaranteed, so they can move on from him this offseason, have him out of the books. And I know that was a player that when they re-signed him, every Dolphins fan gave the collective sigh and groan of, oh, we're ready to move on from Savon Ahmed. But he's had some nice moments. He has had some nice moments with the Dolphins, but the explosive element that has become the calling card of running backs in this offense is just not there. To go back to the tight end position, Jody Fortson, for all of the excitement that I have and kind of the optimism for what Jody Fortson can be, it is worth noting that he got $425,000 in guaranteed salary. So that's not a player that I think is a very attractive cut option because you're going to lose almost half of the $1.06 $1.02 million that he's owed against the cap this year. You're going to lose if you cut him. The contrast of that of Julian Hill, and I know some Dolphins fans are hopeful for Julian Hill, and I still think that there's a pathway for Julian Hill to be a meaningful contributor to the team. He's owed $919,000, so it's almost $1 million. You take on $8,000 in debt cap. So names like Julian Hill, Savon Ahmed, Jeff Wilson's kind of the big one because he's been an established name. At the wide receiver position in particular, River Craycraft re-signed for $1.1 million. None of that is guaranteed salary. You contrast that to Braxton Berrios. You'd lose more money than you would save if you cut Braxton Berrios because it's a 1-year deal. So there's no post June 1st designation to split the dead cap. It just is what it is, right? $1.2 million in dead cap versus $932,000 in savings. He got $750,000 guaranteed. So if you're sitting here trying to decide between River Craycraft and Braxton Berrios, I think Braxton's your de facto punt returner. I don't know that he'll get the run on kickoff returns that he did last year because of the change in the kickoff rules. But from a offense depth player / special teams punt return duties, I think Braxton Berrios with the $750,000 in guaranteed salary. It's not an overwhelming amount, but if you told me you'd save less than half of moving on, you'd keep another player's worth of salary at $1.2 million in dead money to move on from Braxton after you brought him back. He would have to have a catastrophic camp for that versus River Craycraft, who's $1.1 million in salary that is completely non-guaranteed. We're going to go over to the defensive side of the ball next. Here on this episode of Locked On Dolphins, look at some bubble players who should be keeping their eyes peeled, and we should be keeping our eyes peeled as far as potential threats for the Dolphins to make some margins, victories as they get ready for the start of training camp here in just a couple weeks. They'll be here before we know it, so make sure you stick with us here on Locked On Dolphins. Today's episode of Locked On Dolphins is sponsored by BetterHelp. Comparison could be the thief of joy, and it's easy to envy other people's lives when you see it from afar. It can be very easy for people to show their lives as completely together on Instagram, but in reality, everyone has their things that they're fighting. Therapy can help you focus on what you want instead of what others have, so you can start living your best life. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's designed to be convenient, flexible, suited to your schedule, entirely online. Just fill out a brief questionnaire and get matched with a licensed therapist. And you can switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Stop comparing and start focusing with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOn today to save 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOn. We did this when we did the 53-man roster projection, but Duke Riley defensively is the big one for me because it's the largest amount of cap savings for a player that's going to be a backup / depth player that has a lot of competition. And I like Duke. I know Duke kind of has soured on some fans based on the way the play at the end of the season last year went when he was put in some unenviable positions. But I like Duke Riley as a player. That's somebody that would be welcome on my football team any year as far as a special teams linebacker that can run, cover a lot of ground. He's due over $3 million against the cap. You could save $2.5 million of that by moving on. And if you think about it, the pathway for him as a special teams player is beating out Cam Brown, who's a special teams specialist, beating out Anthony Walker Jr., who's a more experienced starting player. So if you have one player who is competing with you with what your bread and butter is, and you have another player who's more experienced as a depth starter effectively, he's got two guys that I think do mitigate his upside. The thing that Duke has going for him is that he can be both of those players in one. The question is just, is it worth $3 million or $2.5 million in savings, really, if you wanted to try to retain his services. That's what the Dolphins are going to have to, when they sit down and they go through all the rooms and they talk about all the guys that they need, and Danny Crossman gives his input for the guys that he needs for special teams. That's, I imagine, going to be a pretty in-depth conversation to try to sort out what that looks like. But the fact that you can save $2.5 million for Duke Riley is something that I think does work against his favor as it pertains to trying to forecast the bubble. Saron Neal's another player who came in from a special teams specialist perspective that I think looms as a big threat to a player who's been tenured here and the team's been invested in, and they brought him back on a deal. And that's Elijah Campbell. Between the two players, as a comparison, Saron Neal got $300,000 in guaranteed salary and a $350,000 signing bonus. So he's on the books for $1.95 million. Elijah Campbell coming back is on the books for $1.475 million with about 75% of the amount of guaranteed salary that Saron Neal got. So in the battle for safety 4, right? 4.5, depending on where you're going to put Nick Needham in that conversation. Those are two guys with special teams chops. Saron Neal's a big-time special teams specialist, and that, I think, looms as a potential threat for Elijah Campbell. How many DBs do they want with as much flexibility and ambiguity as possible? Because if they want to really covet that, I don't think Elijah has the kind of versatility. That being said, he's a player who'd be more than welcome to be on my team any year for being a special teams type of player. So Elijah Campbell is another one. And I would throw in, to go back to linebacker, we've reached the tipping point with Channing Tindall. We've reached the point where the savings are not going to be, or the dead money is not going to be cost prohibitive for a third-round rookie contract for a player in his third year. If the Dolphins don't want to carry a ton, I'd be surprised, because I do ultimately think the kind of the draft and develop mantra, this is a player who's coming into year 3. You'd like to think the light bulb's going to come on at some point, but if it doesn't this year, they will ask themselves, do we need the special teams slot? Or can we carry what would be I would assume one of Cam Brown and Duke Riley would make the roster. I would assume Anthony Walker would make the roster, although I don't think that's a sure thing, just because he did sign for effectively a vet minimum type of deal. Do you carry 5 linebackers? They didn't carry 5 linebackers last year. You would save $1.16 million against the cap with a $200,000 dead money hit to move on from Channing Tindall. But he's still 24 years old. They've remained invested to this point. They have had a couple of players that have underperformed in the early seasons of their rookie contracts that the team has been willing to wait it out on for players. So I think that's the best thing Channing Tindall has going for him, is the precedent set by some players who have come before him with this regime of, hey, this is still a really young player. Let's give it some time. And to go back to the offensive side of the ball, I think Eric Ezukama falls in the same bucket. You know, it's not super cost prohibitive. If you cut him from a dead cap perspective, you'd save almost $1 million there with $181,000 in dead money this year, and then another $181,000 in dead money next year if he did not make the roster. So they're not locks, but I think the precedent for young players for both of those guys does kind of give them what you would assume to be a little optimism that they're going to continue to get another look. We've gone through most of my list. The other name that's notable is DeShawn Hand, who has no guaranteed money on his contract at all. And as you get deeper into this, you're looking at guaranteed salary, right? You want to know, who did they not tie themselves to for commitments? Just to read through some of the guaranteed salaries of guys that are continuing to be on the bubble. Kader Kohu, I expect he'll make the team. He's been a meaningful contributor, but there's no guaranteed salary there. He's in year 3. You could save $985,000 against the cap. So it's almost $1 million in cap space. DeShawn Hand has no guaranteed salary. Of the guys that they signed on the defensive line, the lowest guaranteed salary amount is that for Jonathan Harris at $325,000. But he got a $300,000 signing bonus as well. So you need over $500,000 if you moved on from Jonathan Harris. So I think that bodes well for him. You contrast that to, say, Tier Tart. You'd save less money for Tier Tart, but you'd also take on about the same amount of dead cap hit. So that's where that's a lot of performance-only motivations, I think, is going to push those cuts in one way or another in that defensive line group. So bubble guys, the heavy-hitting bubble guys on either side of the ball are Jeff Wilson, Duke Riley. But there's plenty of other examples of guys that are going to be bottom of the roster guys that extra layer is going to be applied to the conversation, or at least it should be if they're doing it right. They're going to be process-oriented, and they're going to reflect on all of the variables that are going to impact the decision, not just for competitiveness this year, but long-term salary cap benefit and winning in the margins. We're about 2 weeks away from strapping on the pads, and I guess 3 weeks away from strapping on the pads, and being able to start to answer these questions with your performance on the field. We have some great stuff coming up next week here on Locked On Dolphins. Make sure you keep it locked in right here with us on Locked On Dolphins, because it is your team every day. I appreciate you guys checking out the show. Make it a great rest of your day. Make it a great weekend. We'll be back again on Monday. Fins up. I'll see you then.